Hey everyone, going to be documenting the Westcott Designs TRD lift kit. This is the off-road package. It's got the red axles and the red Bilstein shocks, and going to be installing the Bilstein front and rear shocks plus the Westcott Designs preload collar lift kit. It's sort of a hack in the sense that Westcott Designs realized that everything is really the same on the TRD lift kit. And assuming you have those red axles and the red Bilstein shocks, this kit is compatible with the factory springs that come on these. All you have to do is change out these shocks. So they do make a kit that does not require the shock change, but for the off-road customers, this is a way to get the TRD quote-unquote lift kit without the expense and the parts list of all the other things that are needed in that kit. It's a very expensive kit. I believe Toyota's offering it for about $3,000 as an add-on. It comes pre-spec'd from the manufacturer. However, I did not have that option. I don't know if this gives you the full, 3 inches, because their kit basically says it gives you about 2.3 in the front. I've watched enough Westcott videos to know that they always say to mark the distance from the center of the wheel to the bottom of the fender. However, I decided to go right from the bottom lip to get an accurate measurement. And actually the measurements are all the same. They're actually pretty even right now. I have a full tank of gas. It's 22 and 7/8 in the front and 24 and 7/8 in the rear. So I will be able to do a before and after measurement. I did watch one video recently where they came out and they ended up removing this front preload collar, front spacer, sorry. So that's a good question if I'm going to use that or not. I think I'm going to try it with, because they say that the kit gives a full 2.3 in the front. And this does not require any additional upper control arms or anything else. They even supply a brake line bracket. I believe that's for the rear, bump stop spacers, shock spacers. You get the awesome sticker, obviously, which I'll throw on the lift. I had the Westcott Designs TRD Pro preload spacer kit on my 4Runner, and I really liked it. It firmed up the ride, it removed that nosedive in the front and that bounce. And honestly, it's still to this day, I really love the way that kit sat. So I do believe that people were sort of, the feedback was mixed. And on the standard Westcott preload kit for the Tundra, you see a lot of people just saying, just get the icons, get something else. But I'm not doing any serious off-roading. I just want a nice level look, going to be fitting on most likely 35s or close to 35. So I want to make sure there's no rubbing, no problems. And I think, I'm a big supporter of Westcott. I like their product. I like that Jeff is always on the pages answering and helping. And I think this kit, from what I felt like, it was sort of a response to, hey, we can give you a little bit more rebound, because essentially this has an inch and I believe in 3/4 extra length up top. It gives you a little bit more rebound, makes for not as harsh of a ride. Even though a lot of people say the ride is just fine, there are plenty of other people saying it's a little firm. And I believe Jeff himself has said that a lot of it is due to the way that the vehicle is aligned, not to add in too much negative camber. There's a bunch of things he makes sure that customers realize that will all impact the ride height. But I can't wait to set this up on my Tundra. And I'll give you guys a little bit of a glimpse along the way, and hopefully I can do some, post review in the sense of how does it feel on the road, because I have about 3,500 miles on this Tundra, and I really like the way it rides currently. So I'm hoping to preserve some of that. All right, got the wheels off, and it's always a good idea to take a look at how everything is situated, document it, take some pictures. You can see these are the red axles and the red Bilsteins on the off-road package. And I believe the red axles are longer, and that is what's required with a lift, so that way your axle doesn't pop out. But essentially we'll be reusing that spring. I know in the Westcott video they powder coated that spring. I don't have that luxury. And in the rear, it's a different kind of setup. Shock is separate from the spring itself. And the spring sits down in there. Got the bump stop right up here. All right, just following the Westcott video, really informative. Show you what we're doing here. Remove the lower bolt through the shock, disconnect the sway bar, and then you loosen up the cam bolts with a 24mm wrench. I didn't have a wrench, I just used a socket. It was a little bit difficult to get in there. I had to loosen up this, I guess they call that a skid plate, but it feels like some cheap material. Lower spindle bolts. And this thing just dropped right down, super easy. I think the next step is literally just to loosen up those 3 bolts right up top, and this thing will slide right down. All right, just remove the 4 14mm bolts holding that strut mount. Next up is the spring compressor. This is exactly the way it came out. I'm going to take notice of that. Even though I'm changing over the preload and the preload collar and the shock, it's important just to see the orientation and just to make a note of it, so that way you get it back together, it's the same way. Oh, there's actually a marking on the top that says out, so that's pretty easy. Don't have to worry too much about that. We'll see how this goes. All right, these are what the spring compressors look like. They were purchased on Amazon. I actually bought these for my TRD Pro 4Runner. I've used the big square ones for smaller springs for other cars, but the truck springs are much thicker, and once you start compressing the coils, the larger ones don't fit properly. So get the ones that have kind of like the claw, wrap them with electrical tape so nothing scratches, and you're essentially just compressing the spring until you can, wiggle that center shock, and then you can loosen up the top because it's not going to be under pressure anymore. All right, so using an impact, I had to charge this baby up because otherwise it's a little bit more difficult to get it out. I removed this top nut, the springs were compressed, the spring was compressed, and out comes the bottom. I will be paying notice on how this is all set up, so that way I'm going to get the new strut and the preload collar in the same place. And I did end up marking the locations of the spring to seat area, so that way everything is all set up. And I think this is what Jeff from Westcott was trying to showcase. So let's take a look at how this all seats and sits. You can see the preload collar puts the perch up a little higher, adds a little bit more preload. That's essentially what's lifting the vehicle. I believe the shock and the shaft is all the same sizing, but take a look at the top. Look at all that extra room. And that's going to help your rebound, and it'll help you essentially not feel like it's going to crash. It'll give it a little bit more range in the setup. So I definitely think that's positive. We'll see how it all goes together, but I set up the preload, the lower area, so that way it slips in the same way. And here it is, all wrapped up. Super easy with the impact. You just tighten that one nut up top. Make sure it was all lined up here. The spring, the rubber in the middle, and like the top mount. Everything went back together perfectly. It's seated properly. And this is ready to go back in. She's waiting for you. All right, just slipped it in, red Loctite on those top 4. New castle nuts that they provide. And the only thing I had to do, actually, I had to rotate that shock body a little bit because I had it in the wrong orientation. However, everything else was in the correct orientation. So just put a pry bar through the bottom, twisted it. Now it's lined up with the lower control arm slot for that shock body. All right, everything was going pretty smooth until I had to put on those lower spindle bolts. I fought with those. It is an aluminum carrier back here. It is imperative that you do not cross thread it. So use a pry bar up top and you can push this down. The guy in the video did it single-handedly at Westcott, and I didn't want to risk that. I had somebody help me, pushed it down, and then I jacked this up once this was installed and slipped on the end link for the sway bar. So there was a lot of tension and it was pretty difficult. So be prepared for that. Make sure you have a good pry bar. Yeah, as far as clearances go, it is really tight. I think Jeff said in one of the videos, if you don't use the top spacer, you can get a finger in there. It is definitely more than just a piece of paper in terms of the fitment, but it is tight when it's at full droop. I did end up using the spacer, and we'll see how all this goes. All right, just wrapped up the passenger side after having a few hiccups and needed a few clarifications. Honestly, the spindle, everything was a lot quicker on this one. Just got it on the first round. Just torqued everything up. Used the Loctite as they suggested. And the sway bar, I had to do the same thing with the sway bar. I didn't need to jack up for the spindle, but I needed to jack up just put the jack right underneath on the spindle and just moved it up a little bit so I can get that sway bar bolt. And everything went together nicely on this one. I would say it took about 40 minutes all in. And the first side took a lot longer than that. So I don't know, probably all in about 2 hours so far, maybe a little bit more. But in theory, it's all straightforward. It's easy, it hung up on a few things. I'm gonna move to the rear and keep you guys posted. All right, we're on to the rear. Much more simple overall. In theory, the Westcott video is just for the preload, the spacer essentially. It doesn't include the shock, so we're working on the shock right now. You have to loosen up the sway bar end link, you remove the shock bolt, and essentially then you have enough movement in this to pop the spring out. The spacer lift, I already threw it up in there. And right now we're working on the shock. I don't have a trans jack or whatever it's called, so just using the old-fashioned little jack, but just got to pop this thing out. It's a little bit difficult because we're going to have to grab onto the body of the shaft and then loosen it. So we'll get there. All right, pulled that rear shock out and check out the difference. Pretty much what you saw in the front. It's got a lot of extra travel for that rebound. And I think this will complete everything. So we'll keep you posted. All right, last corner. Going good. This spacer just sits right on top. There's no bolt holding it through. Some of the kits I know have a bolt that holds it, but the tension of this is totally fine. It just seats right in the upper area, and that's your spacer lift for the rear. All right, the final piece is this little bracket that Westcott now includes with this TRD lift kit. I'll show you how it looks installed in a second, but you can see how tight the brake lines are, and they want to give it some extra slack. It's going to go right up in here. All right, so I put in that little bracket they provided. There wasn't really any clear instructions. I believe I got it set up right. But you can see the brake lines both have a lot more slack before they were super tight. All right, just got to put the wheels on. We'll do a quick measurement once this is all done. Everything went smooth. Of course, it always takes longer than you think. I would say this took about, I don't know, realistically, at least 4 hours. But I think you can expect, 3 to 5 hours if it's your first time installing it. Of course, there's always going to be hiccups, but it is straightforward. Definitely can be a DIY if you have the right tools. Look over that Westcott Designs video. They have a lot of the tools mentioned, and they are definitely important. Definitely need a torque. You need to be able to measure your torque, and you need a breaker bar. You need certain sizes that most people aren't going to have, but we'll see how it looks in a moment. All right, just got the wheels torqued up and went for a spin around the complex. Went in reverse, used the brake a little bit, try to settle it down a little bit. It is really, really tall. Not really sure how I feel about this. We'll see after I commute back and forth to work. It'll be another 50 miles or so. We'll see if this settles down, but it essentially went from my measurements, and that was from the bottom of the center cap, not the center like Westcott does. It went from about 22 7/8 to about 26 3/4. So it went up over 3 inches in the front, and the back went up to 26 3/8 from about 24 7/8. These are pretty close measurements. So the front and rear are sitting about the same, but I could have sworn I remember Westcott saying you want it to be a little bit higher in the rear, and it'll drive better that way. But right now it's close to level, but I believe the front is a little bit higher. I'll do another measurement tomorrow, see how that goes. It looks really big though. And obviously a little wimpy with the stock tires and wheels, but that is definitely changing very soon. And it 100% needs an alignment. I mean, it's so out of whack right now. That could be it as well. But I got like positive camber essentially. All right, definitely keep you posted and see how tomorrow goes. All right, so came in the next morning and here I am. And put about 50 miles on the vehicle between going back home and back to the shop this morning, and took another measurement. Before I get into that, I just want to show you what's included with the Westcott Designs lift kit. Again, the Westcott Designs is a preload collar along with a spacer for the front, and this basically shows that it will provide, if you use the full kit, it'll provide approximately 2.35 inches of lift to the front of the vehicle. And if you're just using the preload collar, it'll provide 1.75 lift to the front of the vehicle. And again, I called Westcott yesterday and I said, you know, Jeff shows that in one of the videos, he actually removed the spacer up front to get the rake correct of the vehicle. And when I spoke to Westcott yesterday, the guy was very helpful. It was not Jeff. He told me, hey, it's really customer dependent on if you want to run that spacer or not. It all depends if you're carrying things in the rear. And I think what he was getting at was it all depends on, you know, how your rear is set up, because you basically, from what I understand, again, you want some rake and you want the rear to be 1/4 inch or maybe a 1/2 inch higher than the front. And Jeff was explaining that that helps over bumps and how the vehicle handles situations and how it rides and the ride quality. And I really don't want to compromise ride quality. All right, so I came back in the shop this morning and the rear actually did lower a little bit. Sorry, the front did kind of settle down a little bit. The rear stayed exactly the same. My final reading was 26 3/8. I actually put some tape down here so I could see better. I'm using this lower lip here, and I was using the lower lip on the center cap. My final reading was 26 inches and 3/8, and I started at about, what I believe to be 22 7/8, okay? I did the Westcott method, which was to the center. I had somebody with me this morning, and we measured from the center of the wheel to the bottom of the fender, and we got 24 3/4. But for this purpose of the video, let's use my own before and after numbers, and that's essentially what I'm seeing. And you can see that's well over 3 inches there. So it's much more than the 2.35 inch lift that they're stating this will come with. And I have a feeling that's a generic paper, and that's sort of confusing because there's conflicting information. They provide you with a spacer, but they don't really tell you that it's optional, or they don't really tell you exactly what to do with it. So maybe, unless I'm understanding incorrectly, maybe that literature should be changed. And I know this is a new offering with the TRD, you know, shocks and this new preload collar kit that's designed for this, but I think there needs to be some clarity, and I'm actually glad I'm doing this video. Final, the rear ended up staying the same. There was no real settling. It's still the same. 26 1/8 is my after, and before was about 24 7/8. Even if my measurements are off by 1/8, we're still seeing a solid, at least 1 inch, maybe 1.25 inch rear lift. And I did the Westcott method, and I got about 24 5/8. On the rear, and on the front was 24 3/8. So I'm essentially still higher in the front, and I don't want to be, based on what Jeff is saying, and I don't want there to be a compromise in the alignment, so I'm going to take off the spacer. And I think that'll get me exactly where I want. I mean, it looks really good. It looks super tall. It looks tough. Obviously, I need some different wheels, but I think if I remove the spacer, that will certainly get me to where I want. All right, started on the passenger's side first and started the removal. Essentially, you do have to remove everything to do this, and that's why I think this video will be helpful to people in the future, because if you're paying a shop to do this, you're not gonna be happy when they charge you extra labor, and that's exactly what can happen. So fortunately, I spent a little bit of time, took out this, I believe it's a 1/2 inch spacer, could be 3/4. But I think this should put the ride height right where it needs it. The whole assembly needed to come out. I will say there is definitely more clearance right under here. You can put your whole finger in. Before it was very, very, very tight. Under certain flexing conditions, I don't know, maybe it would rub, or probably just rub away a little bit because there is clearance. So I guess if it fits, it ships, sort of say. But going to also remove the bump stop spacer now that the spacer portion of the lift is not installed there. Went back to the original castle nuts, I believe they're called, or whatever those nuts are called, original nuts, the 14 millimeters up top. And it was a lot easier also to put everything back together. There was a lot less tension on the sway bar, and these lower spindle bolts did not give me any trouble because it didn't need to be flexed in as much. There was less tension on the whole system because essentially it elongates this whole strut combo. And believe it or not, it makes a big difference. So we'll do the other side, and then we'll do a quick measurement, and I'll give you some thoughts. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention was I should have shown it before I put this preload collar on, but there were actually two different settings for the C-clip that holds this preload collar on, which I don't believe was ever mentioned. So I don't have the time to mess around with it. However, that is something interesting. Maybe somebody would want to put it on the lower setting and see how that changes the preload and see what kind of height you're at. Or somebody might want even higher, and they prefer the spacer installed there, and they're doing something different on the rear because these kits are sold as front option only. So I guess there are further possibilities, but this is on the original setting, which is on the higher clip, essentially a higher preload setting. And of course the Westcott preload collar makes it even higher and puts the spring at a different portion. So somebody else can mess with it. I don't have the time to do it. I think this will settle off where I want to be with this height. All right, so we're back at it. Just took a quick spin around the complex. And honestly, the removal, because the spring didn't need to come out, it was a quick hour to change it, to remove both spacers. So it wasn't too bad. I had all the tools out from the night before and essentially just got right to work. Super easy to get the spindle bolts back in. Everything just had so much less tension. I really advise you guys going the same way unless you're going for extreme height and you have some other plans. But if you're like me and you're not doing any serious off-roading, I just wanted the truck to be a little bit higher, put on some larger wheels and tires next, and I think this is a good place to start, and this is probably where I'll keep it. So it did settle down overnight from I think 2 3/4 to 2 3/8, so 26 3/8. That was the final this morning before I took out the spacer, and the final right now, before it settles down a little bit, is 26 1/8. I know that will probably get down to 25 7/8 tomorrow or so. So we'll get that rake that we wanted because the rear is currently at 26 1/8, and that's not settling or changing or anything like that. So I do think the front will settle back down. It's perfectly level. The front is not higher. However, I do believe it'll settle down and I'll get that rake that we're looking for. And one thing I want to mention, last night when I drove home, the ride was amazing. I was really pleasantly surprised. It wasn't at all harsh. There was no crashing over bumps. I am super pleased with this kit. I was really hesitant because people were kind of complaining on the forums and the social media pages how Westcott can be a little rough, but of course Jeff responds with the fact that it could be alignment, it could be a rake. So I really wanted to make sure that this got set up properly. That's why I removed that spacer. And even if we do some quick math, if this falls down to 26, and even if my before measurement wasn't perfect, I got a solid 3 inches, maybe a hair more with just a preload collar kit, which is strange again, because the paperwork inside says to get, if you use the full kit, the preload collar and the spacer, you're only gonna get 2.35 inches of lift. So I don't understand how the measurements can be that off. This definitely, looks like a lot more than, just visually, but you can take my word for it in terms of the measurements. I'm not using that preload collar, so the notation, essentially the paperwork that comes with it's telling me that I will basically get under 2 inches, but I've gained actually over 3. So essentially I've done a proper 3 to 1 lift, 3 inches in the front, 1 inch in the rear. It's leveled to the eye, but it's got the rake at this point once it settles down, and I'll be able to get it aligned. I'm using the Westcott alignment spec sheet that is posted on the page now for the product listing. And next up, we're going to lower these lights, because now the front has been lifted so much. Just because you have auto leveling, the premium headlight assemblies, you need to lower those. I'll go into what I'm going to be doing next. You know, we are a lighting company, and we're going to be throwing on some lighting goodies on here. I know this was more of a suspension video, different than you're used to seeing on this channel, but I think people will find use to it. And I can finally remove this tape. It's looking a little silly driving around like that. And we'll get the lights leveled, and we'll set them to an appropriate height. All right, so you lifted your vehicle, and I do have a good guide on a separate link, which I can link up here. However, like I said, we're a lighting company, and I noticed on my drive home last night, I was completely blinding everybody. So just because you have auto leveling headlights that adjust with the load, it does not mean that they will be able to compensate for changes in suspension. So you do need to manually raise or lower the assembly once you have it lifted. This assembly is quite high, so I'll show you the procedure for this, especially now that it's been lifted. That way you're not blinding everybody. And this is simply a baseline, and you can always go back to it and tweak it a little bit further so you maximize your own performance without blinding anybody else. All right, so what you're gonna do is take a measuring stick or measuring tape. You want to be 25 feet away from the wall, and what you're looking for is actually the center point of the assembly. There's actually a dot on this one. Most assemblies do have dots, and we're right at about 45 inches. Anything above 36 inches is considered pretty high vehicle for lights, and you need to use the rule of, I believe it's up to 4 inches lower than the center of the projector, meaning if I'm at 45, my baseline should probably be starting at between 41 and 42. When I say baseline, that means before I get out on the road and just see how it feels. And it depends on the suspension too. Some of the really soft suspensions, you will have issues because there's a lot of floating around, and you will want to make adjustments. And sometimes you have to compromise a tiny bit so that way you're not upsetting other people. So I'm exactly 25 feet away from the wall. That's where my assemblies are. And like I said, I went down to 41. We're gonna use the top side of this piece of tape, and that'll be our starting point. We can see over here that it's a few inches higher. It's like a solid 4 or 5 inches higher. We're gonna use the top of the cutoff beam. And essentially this magnifies in the distance. That degree of change becomes larger and larger as you know, the lights are shooting down the road. So this is crucial. We're gonna lower the assembly down to this point, and I'll show you how we're doing that on this Tundra. I go into more detail about this in my other video, but you can see the letters VOR. That means you're gonna be using the right side of the cutoff. You can see the high spot on each light. That is the right side of the cutoff. The lower spot is the left side, and that would be VOL. But these LED lights, most of them, you're using the top side or the high side of the cutoff, and you can see where the tape is. And you know, these have multi-beam projector lenses, so you want to use basically the topmost portion of that beam and lower it down. All right, if we look down, that's actually the headlight adjuster guide. It's a simple adjustment with a Phillips head screwdriver, and it's actually going on the motor on these lights. So you can see that metal gear in front of it's like that white piece of plastic. That's actually the motor that changes the height of the headlights as there's load. So let's say you hook up a trailer to the back of it, you know, it'll automatically adjust. But first you have to manually set your lights, and that's what we're doing here. All right, so literally just sticking a long Phillips head screwdriver in. And it takes a little bit of time before it actually starts moving. You wanna make sure you're on the gear. So we're going up right now, you wanna go back down. So it's hard to know which way you're going. And it's gonna take a lot of revolutions. That's why you do not want to be in front of your garage door, like 3 feet away, 5 feet away. You wanna be 25 feet away, ideally. You don't have to break out the measuring tape, but you know, 25, 30 feet, you can see what this looks like here. If you want to dial in your adjustment perfectly, yes, you'd want to be at 25 feet. However, this does work to align the headlight assembly. So we're going to maybe lower just a smidge if there's a little bleed over, and we will move to the other assembly in just a moment. All right, we've lowered the passenger side now, and we consider these even. Now, again, multi-beam, they're a little wavy. They look really good on the road, but you can see there's a lot going on with these assemblies. I think this is a good starting point, and I'll take it on the road tonight and see how everything is. But this will essentially conclude the video. I might be able to follow back up with a part 2 and just talk about ride quality, but I was very happy with the ride quality, as I had mentioned before, and I completely recommend this TRD lift as long as you have those the off-road package with those longer red axles and the Bilstein struts, the red ones. That'll give you proper setup. So let us know what you think, and subscribe to the channel if you can. Love to hear from you.